Official history says ancient empires survived on simple farming. Convenient. That phrase quietly erases canals, tax grain, storage law, forced labor, river calendars, and bureaucrats weaponizing barley with excellent handwriting. Today, we open 7 case files on the ancient food systems that turned landscapes into imperial supply chains. The first 6 expose the machinery hidden beneath mud, temples, ports, and lakes. But the final file, a mountain empire storing tomorrow without wheels, coins, or alphabetic writing, forces one unpleasant question. Was agriculture ever simple? Chapter 1. Egypt, the flood that became a payroll department. Case file number 1. You stand on the edge of the Nile as the brown water begins to rise, slow enough to look peaceful, powerful enough to decide whether an entire province eats. Beside you, a provincial Egyptian nomarch watches the flood with the expression of a man pretending nature is predictable because his career requires optimism. Behind him, scribes wait with reed pens. They are not poets. They are the nervous system of the state. If the inundation comes too low, fields crack. If it comes too high, canals collapse. If the canals are poorly cleared, villages accuse the governor. If the grain store's empty, divine kingship suddenly starts looking like expensive theater with a falcon hat. The pharaoh may be the son of Ra, but the local administrator is the man explaining why barley did not arrive. And that is where the old textbook sentence begins to fracture. Egypt was not simply fed by the Nile. Egypt was fed by a calendar, a labor regime, a canal network, a storage system, a tax machine, and a priestly bureaucracy that turned mud into authority. If this anomaly is taken seriously, then one of civilization's favorite simplifications has to be rebuilt from scratch. Abundance was not a miracle of geography. It was an operating system. The object under examination is not one artifact, but a whole agricultural mechanism built around the Nile Valley, the Delta, and the Fayum. By the pre-dynastic period, Egyptian communities were already developing agriculture in these zones, with older evidence of land use reaching deeper into prehistory. The yearly inundation deposited fertile silt across the floodplain. Good seasons produced surplus. That surplus moved into state and temple granaries. Irrigation canals carried water toward outlying fields and villages. Officials regulated construction, maintenance, boundaries, and disputes. Staple crops included emmer wheat, barley, wheat, flax, papyrus, lentils, chickpeas, onions, garlic, and lettuce. Later research into Egyptian grain storage, especially from roughly 2600 to 1650 BCE, shows cereals functioning not merely as food but as wages, exchange media, institutional wealth, and political reserve. Mud, seed, water, accountancy. Civilization apparently required spreadsheets before spreadsheets had the decency to exist. The contradiction is physical and administrative at the same time. Egypt lacked modern pumps, synthetic fertilizer, diesel engines, railways, crop satellites, refrigeration, and weather modeling. It did not have a Ministry of Agriculture producing unreadable reports with pie charts and a reassuring executive summary. Yet it coordinated production along a river corridor hundreds of miles long. It synchronized labor with flood rhythms. It stored surplus against failure. It assessed obligations in grain. It paid workers in grain. It converted grain into construction power, military stability, temple wealth, and royal legitimacy. The Nile provided water. It did not provide management. This is the part usually flattened into the phrase, the gift of the Nile, and one of those elegant expressions that survives because it sounds wise while doing almost none of the work. Rivers do not harvest wheat. Rivers do not inspect canal banks. Rivers do not punish illegal diversions, calculate tax obligations, supervise storage rooms, or decide which work crew receives rations. A river can flood a field, or it cannot run a payroll department. Egyptian abundance came from making nature legible to power. The flood arrived as a seasonal event. The state turned it into a calendar. The calendar became labor scheduling. Labor scheduling became irrigation maintenance. Irrigation maintenance became harvest prediction. Harvest prediction became taxation. Taxation became granary storage. Granary storage became wages, offerings, public works, and famine insurance. Somewhere in that sequence, mud became monarchy. This was the real engineering. Not just canals cut through soil, but social channels cut through the population. A farmer did not merely plant and harvest, he existed inside a measurement system. Fields could be assessed, labor could be demanded, grain could be collected. Temple scribes could record it with a calmness that must have felt spiritual to anyone not being taxed. The palace and temple did not simply bless the food supply. They absorbed it, redistributed it, and used it to prove that cosmic order still worked. The politics are not subtle. Whoever controlled the grain controlled survival with a divine smile. Temples accumulated agricultural wealth. The palace transformed surplus into monuments, soldiers, officials, and ritual spectacle. Priests could present offerings to the gods from stores filled by farmers. The gods, being famously unavailable for audit, accepted the arrangement. Who feared this system? Not the king, not the temple, not the scribes. The people most exposed were those below the ledger line: villagers, canal workers, tenant farmers, harvest laborers, and provincial officials trapped between ecological uncertainty and royal expectation. A bad flood was natural. A missing tax delivery was political. The system distributed food, but it also distributed blame downward. And that explains part of its erasure. Stone survives better than storage policy. Pyramids photograph better than granary ledgers. A colossal statue can impress a tourist in 3 seconds. Canal maintenance law requires attention, which is unfair to everyone involved. So the public memory of Egypt becomes pharaohs, tombs, curses, gold masks, and the comforting idea that the Nile did most of the work. The mud walls, storage rooms, ration lists, field measurements, and agricultural officials become background scenery. History looks at the monument and misses the machine that fed the builders. The orthodox explanation is tidy. Egypt prospered because the Nile flooded regularly, leaving fertile soil, allowing stable agriculture, which allowed civilization to develop. This textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical until the labor appears. Then the math starts behaving badly, because fertility alone does not create surplus. Surplus requires timing, enforcement, transport, storage, and protection from loss. A field can produce grain, but a state must prevent that grain from vanishing into rot, theft, local hoarding, elite capture, failed accounting, bad canals, and the general human talent for ruining systems while calling it tradition. The mainstream story is not wrong. It is incomplete in the way a skeleton is incomplete without organs. Yes, the Nile mattered. Obviously. Remove the Nile, and Egypt becomes a very ambitious sand management project. But water was only the biological foundation. The deeper achievement was administrative choreography, making millions of seasonal decisions appear natural, inevitable, and divinely sanctioned. Several cautious hypotheses emerge. Perhaps Egyptian state formation accelerated not because the river was generous, but because the river was demanding. It required collective timing, maintenance, and conflict resolution at scales that rewarded hierarchy. Perhaps temples became so powerful partly because food storage gave religion a material spine. Perhaps divine kingship lasted not merely because people believed in cosmic order, but because grain distribution made that order edible. Faith is persuasive. Bread is more persuasive. So the courtroom question is not whether the Nile fed Egypt. It did. The question is whether the Nile alone explains Egypt's durability. And here the official answer begins to wobble. A flood can fertilize land for a season. It cannot maintain an empire for millennia unless human institutions learn to capture, measure, store, and weaponize its rhythm. Was Egypt's genius agricultural or bureaucratic? Did divine kingship create the food system, or did the food system make divine kingship believable? And when we praise ancient monuments, are we admiring civilization's achievements, or just the parts heavy enough to survive while the real machinery decayed into dust? The takeaway is uncomfortable because it is still modern. Human societies rarely survive on resources alone. They survive on systems that decide who gets access to resources, who records that access, who enforces it, and who gets blamed when the river refuses to cooperate. Egypt turned a flood into food, food into wages, wages into labor, labor into stone, and stone into eternity. But farther east, another civilization tried to command water with equal ambition and less mercy from the soil. Egypt learned to ride the flood. Mesopotamia dug canals into dry land and discovered a darker lesson. Sometimes the machine that feeds you is also quietly salting your bread. Chapter 2. Mesopotamia. The canal state that salted its own bread. Dossier number 2. You sit beside a temple scribe in southern Mesopotamia as he presses a reed stylus into wet clay, marking barley rations with the emotional warmth of an invoice. Around him, the city breathes through canals. Water moves through fields. Workers move through obligations. Grain moves through storage rooms. Debt moves through families. The gods, naturally, receive excellent administrative support. The scribe does not look like a revolutionary. He looks like a man trying to make the numbers behave before the clay dries. But every mark he makes points toward a dangerous achievement. Mesopotamia built cities in a landscape that did not politely volunteer to feed them. The rivers were powerful but irregular. The land was fertile but thirsty. Rainfall could not be trusted with civilization, which is rude but accurate. So humans cut channels into the plain, forced water toward fields, and created one of history's first great canal states. If this anomaly is taken seriously, then the story of early civilization stops being a cheerful tale about farming villages becoming cities because people learned to cooperate. It becomes something harsher. Cities emerging from water control, institutional coercion, temple estates, labor accounting, and a slow environmental debt that future generations were invited to pay with interest. The case file is southern Mesopotamian irrigation, especially the canal agriculture that supported Sumerian and later urban societies. The data is blunt. By roughly 3,400 to 3000 BCE, Mesopotamia had produced some of the earliest known urban bureaucracies and writing systems, with official institutions managing agriculture and economic activity. In 1958, Thorkild Jacobson and Robert Maxey Adams published a classic science study arguing that progressive salinization and siltation contributed to agricultural decline in southern Mesopotamia. Later research continues to treat irrigation salinization as a major long-term problem, especially in the late 3rd and early 2nd millennia BCE. The contradiction is beautifully unpleasant. The same irrigation system that made dense urban life possible also helped concentrate salts in the soil, reducing yields over time. A food machine became a slow chemical trap, very efficient. In the way a noose is efficient, the engineering challenge was severe. Mesopotamia did not have electric pumps, concrete-lined drainage grids, satellite soil monitoring, modern hydrological modeling, or a board consultant explaining salinity risk in a conference room. It had rivers, mud, labor gangs, canals, levees, fields, and institutions powerful enough to demand that human backs replace missing technology. Irrigation solved the immediate crisis. It moved water where rainfall failed. It expanded arable land. It supported surplus. Surplus supported cities. Cities supported temples, palaces, specialists, traders, soldiers, and scribes. And scribes supported the oldest human tradition in government, proving that suffering has been properly documented. But water carries memory. In hot, dry regions, irrigation can leave salts behind as water evaporates. Without adequate drainage and flushing, salts accumulate in the upper soil. Crops suffer. Yields fall. Farmers shift strategies. Institutions demand output anyway. The field becomes less generous, but the ledger remains ambitious. That is the paradox. Mesopotamia solved scarcity by building a water regime, then discovered that a water regime is not automatically a fertility regime. Bringing water to land is easy compared with persuading land not to become chemically exhausted under repeated command. The first part looks like progress. The second part looks like accounting refusing to read the soil. The politics were embedded from the beginning. Canals centralize power because water is never just water. It is timing, access, boundary, labor, tax, debt, and punishment. Whoever controls the canal controls the harvest before the seed is even planted. Temple and palace institutions could organize digging, dredging, repair, allocation, and dispute settlement. They could transform irrigation into dependency. This did not merely feed the city, it disciplined the countryside. A farmer near a canal was not free in the romantic sense. He was connected, which is often worse. Connected to upstream decisions, connected to maintenance obligations, connected to temple storage, connected to ration systems, connected to the possibility that a blocked channel, a broken levee, or a bad allocation could turn survival into litigation before writing had fully finished inventing bureaucracy. Who benefited? The institutions at the hydraulic center. Temples gained grain, labor, and authority. Palaces gained predictable extraction. Scribes gained professional permanence, the ancient version of job security, achieved by making society too complicated to function without them. Priests could wrap resource management in sacred language. The grain ration could become not just payment, but moral order. Who feared the truth? Anyone whose legitimacy depended on pretending the system was eternally rational. Salinization does not flatter power. It whispers that the celebrated machine has costs. It suggests that yesterday's miracle may be tomorrow's liability. Institutions are famously brave when demanding sacrifice from others. They become more delicate when asked to examine their own foundations. So the ecological cost moved downward and forward. Downward to cultivators facing weaker fields. Forward to descendants inheriting soils made poorer by decisions made profitable in the present. The administrative class could record declining yields with exquisite precision. Clay tablets preserve many things, including the old governmental talent for knowing bad news and continuing anyway. The orthodox explanation says Mesopotamian civilization rose because irrigation allowed agriculture in an arid environment, and later declined through a mixture of environmental stress, invasion, political fragmentation, and economic change. This is reasonable. It is balanced. It has the calm tone of a museum label trying not to start an argument. This textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical until the math completely breaks down. Because saying irrigation allowed civilization is only half the sentence. The other half is that irrigation demanded maintenance, produced inequality, centralized authority, altered soils, and created a dependency so large that stopping was not an option. A canal system is not a garden hose. It is a political constitution written in mud. Once cities depend on it, every blockage becomes a crisis. Every allocation becomes power, and every harvest failure becomes evidence in the trial of the state. The mockery should be precise. Ancient Mesopotamians did not decline because they were too simple to understand farming. They understood farming well enough to produce urbanism, writing, taxation, estate management, ration systems, and long-distance exchange. The failure was not primitive ignorance. It was a familiar institutional achievement, building a system so successful that nobody in authority wants to admit it is eating its own floorboards. Several careful hypotheses remain open. Perhaps Salinization did not single-handedly destroy southern Mesopotamia, but amplified political and economic vulnerability over centuries. Perhaps institutional pressure for short-term grain output made long-term soil management harder. Perhaps canal agriculture created a hierarchy that was excellent at mobilizing labor, yet poor at listening to ecological feedback until the feedback became expensive enough to be called fate. There is a cold lesson here. Human systems often call themselves advanced when they can extract more. They call themselves wise only after extraction starts failing. Was Mesopotamia defeated by nature or by a successful system that could not stop being successful? Did the first bureaucracies create cities? Or did canal dependency create bureaucracies? And if clay tablets could preserve the evidence of decline, why did preservation not become prevention? The answer is not that ancient people were foolish. The answer is worse. They were recognizable. They built an infrastructure that solved hunger, empowered institutions, demanded constant maintenance, and shifted hidden costs into the future. Then they administered the consequences with professional seriousness. Egypt rode the flood and turned grain into divine order. Mesopotamia forced rivers into channels and learned that control has residue. But across the Mediterranean, another empire would stretch the same question to a terrifying scale. It would not only manage fields or canals, it would feed a city of nearly 1 million people by outsourcing its stomach to ships, provinces, ports, and panic. Chapter 3. Rome. The empire that fed 1 million by outsourcing panic. The third anomaly on our list takes you to Rome, where you stand near the Tiber among sweating dock workers, grain sacks, mule carts, warehouse clerks, sailors, guards, and the unmistakable smell of a city pretending it is eternal while waiting for lunch. Somewhere inside this machinery sits the Praefectus Annoni, the official responsible for Rome's grain supply. He is not merely a bureaucrat. He is the man placed between hunger and riot, which is a very Roman career path. Administrative responsibility with a small chance of public screaming. His problem is simple only if spoken by someone who has never moved food. Rome is enormous. Its stomach is larger than its surrounding farmland. Its citizens expect bread. Its elites expect order. Its emperor expects gratitude. And the Mediterranean, inconsiderately, contains storms. If this anomaly is fully understood, the usual portrait of Roman greatness has to be redrawn. The empire was not sustained by legions, marble, law, and roads alone. It survived because a pre-industrial state learned to outsource panic across the sea. The official case file is the Annona, Rome's imperial grain supply system. At its height, the city of Rome is commonly estimated at close to 1 million people. Grain arrived from Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily. The supply system relied on state regulation, private merchant shipping, contracted public service, warehouse management, inspection, river transport, and imperial ports. Portus, established under Claudius and Nero and enlarged under Trajan, included a massive harbor complex, a famous hexagonal basin, warehouses, aqueduct work, a canal link to the Tiber, and road access. The long-standing connection between Portus and the Alexandrian grain trade was not decorative. It was survival infrastructure. No steamships, no railways, no refrigeration, no container cranes, no weather radar. No modern insurance market calmly absorbing maritime disaster with paperwork and denial. Just ships, contracts, warehouses, imperial authority, and the ancient belief that if the bread failed, politics became edible. The contradiction is scale. Contradiction. A village can feed itself from nearby fields. A small town can lean on its hinterland. But Rome was not a town. It was a gravitational wound in the food map of the Mediterranean. Grain had to be grown elsewhere, collected elsewhere, shipped across dangerous water, unloaded at ports, stored in Horea, moved along canals and roads, barged up the Tiber, measured, guarded, distributed, and converted into public calm. The engineering was not one spectacular machine. It was a chain of fragile competencies. Agricultural estates in distant provinces had to produce surplus. Merchant vessels had to sail in seasonal windows. Harbor infrastructure had to prevent bottlenecks. Warehouses had to protect grain from moisture, fire, pests, theft, and creative accounting. Officials had to coordinate private operators without surrendering political control. The Tiber had to remain useful enough to move bulk cargo inland. The people had to believe the system would function again tomorrow. That last component is important. Food supply is partly logistics and partly psychology. Rome's grain system did not merely feed bodies, it managed public expectation. The annona was welfare, infrastructure, crowd control, imperial theater, and hostage negotiation fused into one apparatus. Bread was not just bread. It was proof that the empire worked. When grain arrived, the emperor looked stable. When grain failed, every marble statue in the city became less persuasive. The politics were brutally clear. The urban population mattered because it was concentrated, vocal, and close to power. Hungry peasants scattered across provinces are tragic. Hungry crowds in the capital are regime-level inconvenience. Rome's rulers understood this. They did not distribute grain because they were gentle philosophers of social equality. They did it because a million-person city without food becomes a seminar in political mortality. Who benefited from this system? The emperor, obviously. The urban plebs when the ships arrived. Senators and equestrians whose estates produced grain. Ship owners who contracted with the state. Port managers, warehouse officials, inspectors, financiers, and every middleman standing between a provincial harvest and a Roman loaf. The system created stability, but also dependence. Rome's greatness sat on other people's fields. That is the layer polite histories often soften. The capital's food security required provincial extraction. Egypt was not merely a romantic land of pyramids and mysterious cats. It was a grain engine under imperial control. North Africa was not just a map label. It was calories in waiting. Sicily had been feeding Roman power for centuries. Provinces became the empire's pantry. And pantries are rarely asked how they feel about the arrangement. Who feared disruptions? Everyone with power. A failed Alexandrian shipment was not a shipping issue. It was a political omen wearing barnacles. If North Africa became unstable, if Egypt rebelled, if storms delayed fleets, if pirates reappeared, if warehouses burned, if river transport failed, Rome could discover very quickly that civilization is only 3 missed meals away from a new theory of government. The orthodox explanation says Rome became powerful because of legions, roads, law, citizenship, engineering, and disciplined administration. Fair. None of that is imaginary. The legions mattered, roads mattered, law mattered, aqueducts mattered. Roman concrete, much like Roman ambition, had impressive staying power. This textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical until the bread enters the courtroom. Legions do not march on patriotic speeches. Roads do not matter if the granaries are empty. Law cannot be eaten, even when carved beautifully. Marble temples do not calm a crowd looking for grain, though they do provide excellent scenery for unrest. The empire's political stability was not only built from conquest. It was loaded in sacks, inspected at ports, stacked in warehouses, and moved upriver like an empire-sized grocery delivery. The oversimplification is subtle because Roman power looks so solid. Stone tricks the eye. Roads remain visible. Amphitheaters survive. Military victories make excellent chapter titles. But grain logistics are harder to romanticize. A warehouse receipt does not dominate the imagination like a triumphal arch. A harbor basin lacks the moral drama of a battlefield, unless one understands that a delayed grain fleet could be more dangerous to the emperor than an enemy cavalry charge. Several cautious hypotheses follow. Perhaps the annona should be treated as one of Rome's core political institutions, not a secondary economic detail. Perhaps imperial ideology depended as much on dependable calories as on conquest mythology. Perhaps the very scale that made Rome magnificent also made it structurally anxious, because the city's survival required constant obedience from distant landscapes, private shippers, seasonal winds, and provincial politics. That is not strength in the simple sense. It is managed vulnerability. The prosecution might ask whether Rome conquered the Mediterranean, or whether Rome became dependent on the Mediterranean after conquest. Did the empire feed the capital? Or did the capital force the empire into becoming a food delivery system with swords? And when modern people admire Roman urban greatness, are they admiring engineering genius? Or the successful concealment of logistical panic? The deeper lesson is cold and familiar. Power often presents itself as self-contained. Palaces imply permanence. Capitals imply centrality. Empires imply control. But every center depends on peripheries it prefers not to acknowledge. Rome looked like the heart of the world. In food terms, it was also a mouth, open constantly, demanding that the provinces keep chewing on its behalf. Egypt turned a flood into administration. Mesopotamia turned canals into urban life and chemical debt. Rome turned the sea into a grain corridor and made hunger a matter of imperial security. But far to the east, another state would solve the food problem with a stranger kind of restraint. It would face a violent river and choose not to dominate it with a wall, but to persuade it with geometry. Chapter 4. Qin and Han China. Dujiangyan, the dam that wasn't there. Our fourth stop breaks the timeline in 256 BCE, where you stand on the edge of the Minjiang River and watch an engineer choose not to fight the water like a man with something to prove. His name is Li Bing, remembered as a Qin governor and hydraulic engineer. In the normal heroic version of ancient engineering, this is where someone orders a massive dam, blocks the river, conquers nature, carves an inscription, and waits for future textbooks to applaud the confidence. Li Bing does something more irritating to the simple narrative. He refuses the obvious solution. The river floods. It silts. It shifts force through the landscape with the calm violence of moving physics. A brute wall could trap water, but it could also trap sediment, intensify risk, and eventually become a monument to administrative overconfidence. So the solution is not domination. It is redirection. Split the river, guide the current, drain the excess. Let the water carry part of the burden. If this anomaly is understood properly, the old assumption that ancient engineering was primitive because it lacked industrial machinery begins to look lazy. Dujiangyan was not impressive because it overpowered nature. It was impressive because it listened to nature closely enough to manipulate it. The official object is the Dujiangyan irrigation system in Sichuan, associated with the Qin expansion into the Chengdu Plain. UNESCO identifies it as an ecological engineering system constructed around 256 BCE, using natural topography and hydrology to divert irrigation water, drain sediment, control floods, and regulate flow without dams. Its key components include the Yuzui bypass dike, the Feishayan floodgate, and the Baopingku diversion passage. The system is still in use after roughly 2,280 years, and UNESCO states that it now irrigates 668,700 hectares of farmland. One river, three main hydraulic elements. Zero massive blocking dam. More than 2 millennia of operation. Very primitive, obviously, in the way a surgical instrument is primitive because it is not a hammer. The contradiction is technical. A conventional dam asserts control by stopping flow. Dujiangyan works by refusing to stop it completely. The Yuzui structure divides the river. The Feishayan element helps handle floodwater and sediment. The Baopingku passage regulates entry into the irrigation zone. The system uses river behavior as part of the machinery. Flow division is not a side effect. Sediment movement is not an inconvenience. Seasonal variation is not ignored. These are the operating conditions. This is why Dujiangyan feels almost offensively modern. Its intelligence is not in a single giant object. It is in a relationship between water, slope, channel, sediment, and timing. It turns the river's own force into a maintenance partner. It reduces catastrophic dependence on one blocking structure. It does not ask the landscape to become dead matter. It negotiates with moving matter. The engineering challenge was immense because the Minjiang was not a polite canal waiting to be improved. It was a mountain-fed river delivering water, silt, and flood risk toward a region with major agricultural potential. Control the river, and the Chengdu Plain becomes a food engine. Fail, and the same water becomes destruction with excellent momentum. In modern terms, Dujiangyan was flood control, irrigation distribution, sediment management, and strategic agricultural infrastructure fused into one hydraulic organism. In political terms, it was state capacity made wet. The Qin did not simply need pretty fields, it needed surplus. Surplus feeds workers. Workers build roads, walls, fortifications, canals, palaces, and armies. Armies conquer. Conquest requires logistics. Logistics requires food. Food requires water that arrives neither too violently nor too late. The circle is not poetic, it is administrative. Dujiangyan helped transform Sichuan into a stable agricultural base. That mattered for Qin power. It supported taxation, settlement, expansion, and military provisioning. A hydraulic system is rarely just a hydraulic system once a state realizes it can convert grain into obedience. Water enters the field. Grain enters the storehouse. Labor enters the register. The empire smiles. Who benefited? The Qin state first. Local agricultural communities, when the system worked. Administrators who could claim control over flood and fertility. Later dynasties that inherited a functioning water machine without having to invent the miracle again. The system's success was so durable that it created its own form of invisibility. If infrastructure works long enough, people stop calling it genius and start calling it normal. That is one of the quietest kinds of erasure. Dujiangyan was not forgotten in the simple sense. It remained famous, maintained, used, adapted, celebrated. But it was often reduced in broad historical memory to ancient irrigation, a phrase with all the emotional power of a filing cabinet. The radical part disappears under the category label. Ancient irrigation sounds like people digging channels with baskets. Dujiangyan was closer to river behavior design. Calling it a canal is like calling a jet engine a metal tube with confidence. The orthodox explanation says ancient Chinese engineers built irrigation works that improved agricultural productivity and helped states expand. Fair enough. The statement is not false, it is just so smooth that it removes the teeth from the achievement. This textbook narrative is elegant and perfectly logical until the absence of the dam becomes the central evidence. Because the genius of Dujiangyan is negative engineering. Its most important feature is what it does not do. It does not seal the river behind a giant barrier. It does not concentrate all failure into one monumental object. It does not treat sediment as an afterthought. It does not imagine that nature becomes obedient because an official plan says so. It uses geometry, topography, and flow to produce control without complete imprisonment. The usual ancient versus modern storyline has a weakness here. Modern people often assume sophistication means more machinery, more concrete, more moving parts, more central command, and a larger maintenance budget that will be regretted later by another department. Dujiangyan suggests a more unsettling definition. Sophistication can mean fewer moving parts, lower fragility, and deeper respect for the thing being controlled. This is not mysticism, it is engineering. Several cautious hypotheses follow from the evidence. Perhaps Dujiangyan survived because it was designed around process rather than obstruction. Perhaps its durability came from allowing the river to remain partially alive as a hydraulic actor, rather than forcing it into static obedience. Perhaps Qin state power grew not only from legal discipline and military organization, but also from ecological competence. The ability to convert a volatile landscape into reliable surplus without destroying the mechanism too quickly. The courtroom question, then, is not whether Dujiangyan was an irrigation system. It was. The question is whether that label is large enough to contain what happened there. Was Li Bing building a waterwork, or was he building a strategic foundation for empire? Was the absence of a dam a limitation, or the deepest proof of intelligence? And why do we still equate ancient engineering with brute force when one of its most enduring masterpieces was an act of restraint? The lesson is almost insulting in its simplicity. Power does not always come from crushing nature. Sometimes it comes from understanding which part of nature is willing to do the work for you. Dujiangyan did not make the river disappear. It made the river useful. Egypt synchronized a flood. Mesopotamia cut canals and inherited salt. Rome stretched its stomach across the sea. Dujiangyan turned hydraulic restraint into imperial agriculture. But across another ocean, in a city built where land and water refused to stay separate, an even stranger solution appeared. Instead of draining the wetland to create farms, people farmed the wetland itself. Chapter 5, Tenochtitlan. The city that farmed the lake. Number 5. You kneel on a narrow strip of dark, wet earth in the basin of Mexico, while a Mexican farmer drives willow stakes into the lake bed and builds a field where a European mapmaker would prefer to see water. Around you, canoes slide through canals, baskets move, mud rises, vegetation rots into fertility. A digging stick enters the soil. Maize, beans, squash, amaranth, chilies, flowers, herbs, and medicinal plants grow in a place that should have been filed under unsuitable for civilization by anyone committed to being wrong with confidence. The farmer does not have draft animals, he does not have iron plows. He does not have pumps, engines, imported fertilizer, refrigerated storage, or a colonial official explaining proper urban planning while standing on stolen hydrology. He has mud, plants, water, memory, and a city that needs to eat. If this anomaly is taken seriously, then Tenochtitlan stops being the exotic capital of an empire that happened to sit in a lake. It becomes something far more technically unsettling. A metropolis fed by wetland agroengineering, where the boundary between farm, canal, road, and ecosystem was deliberately blurred. The city was not surviving despite the lake. The city was eating because of it. The case file is the Chinampa system of Tenochtitlan and the wider basin of Mexico. At the time of the Spanish conquest, Tenochtitlan was among the largest cities in the world, with estimates around 200,000 inhabitants. Chinampas were intensive raised fields constructed from lake-bottom sediment, branches, decaying vegetation, and anchored vegetation. Their canals averaged roughly 5 meters deep and 4 to 6 meters wide, functioning as irrigation channels, transport routes, and ecological edges. The system supported an astonishing biological range, including 51 domesticated species and 96 non-domesticated species associated with Chinampa agriculture. No Old World draft animals, no wheeled freight economy in the European sense, no metal plow tearing the wetland into submission. Just artificial islands, canals, organic renewal, urban demand, and a food web with better planning than many modern suburbs. The physical contradiction is blunt. A lake should make agriculture harder under the simplistic model. Too much water, too little dry land, bad place for a city, bad place for fields. Very bad place for people who think civilization begins when wetlands are drained, straightened, renamed, and given a property developer. But the Mexica and their neighbors used the wetland as infrastructure. Lake bottom muck became soil. Canals became access roads. Constant moisture reduced irrigation stress. Decaying vegetation renewed fertility. The raised beds created controllable growing surfaces. Trees and stakes stabilized edges. Canoes moved produce efficiently through the city's watery arteries. The landscape was not conquered by erasure, it was edited. This was engineering without the theatrical need to look like engineering. Chinampas did not function as charming floating gardens drifting around like decorative salad rafts. That phrase is one of the great crimes of lazy description. They were not botanical confetti. They were anchored agricultural platforms integrated with transport, fertility management, water regulation, biodiversity, and urban food supply. Floating gardens sounds poetic because analysis requires lifting something heavier than a metaphor. The deeper impossibility is urban scale. Feeding a dense capital requires reliability. A city of roughly 200,000 people cannot survive on scenic vegetables and imperial vibes. It needs regular output, short transport routes, nutrient cycling, labor organization, market distribution, and political control over the food basin. The Chinampa system compressed food production near the urban core. It turned the lake into a productive surface instead of an obstacle. This is why Tenochtitlan shocked observers. It was not just large, it was organized around a different ecological logic. European cities generally imagined land and water as separate categories. Land holds buildings and farms. Water carries ships, drains waste, or becomes a problem. Tenochtitlan treated water as a partner in agriculture. The city behaved less like a stone machine and more like a wetland organism with markets, temples, tribute, armies, and extremely serious accountants. The politics were embedded in the system. Chinampas supported urban density, but urban density supported empire. Food surplus fed nobles, priests, artisans, warriors, merchants, laborers, and ritual life. Agricultural productivity near the capital reinforced political centrality. Tribute networks extended that power beyond the lake, drawing goods from conquered regions. But the local wetland engine gave the city a strong metabolic base. Who benefited? The Mexica state, urban consumers, market systems, and farmers skilled enough to turn mud into strategic value. Who was threatened by this model? Later colonial power. Intellectually and physically. Because the conquest was not only military, it was ecological. Spanish rule did not merely defeat a city. It began remaking the landscape beneath the city's memory. Tenochtitlan was destroyed, and colonial Mexico City rose over its remains. Lake systems were drained, reshaped, controlled, reduced, and treated as obstacles to European urban order. A city that had functioned through water was replaced by one that repeatedly fought water while insisting it had improved the situation. The results were predictable in the way bad ideas are predictable when backed by authority. Flooding, subsidence. Drainage projects. More flooding, more drainage. Centuries of arguing with a lakebed that had not agreed to stop being a lakebed. The erasure was therefore double. First, the physical food system was damaged by conquest and ecological transformation. Second, the intellectual category was downgraded. Chinampas became a curiosity, an indigenous technique, an unusual garden system, a picturesque survival from a vanished world. The administrative and urban sophistication behind them was softened into folklore. The orthodox explanation says the Aztecs used chinampas, often called floating gardens, to grow food around Tenochtitlan. This statement is tidy, approachable, and only mildly destructive. This textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical until one asks how a garden helped feed one of the largest cities on Earth. A garden is optional. Chinampas were infrastructure. A garden decorates a household. Chinampas supported a metropolis. A garden can fail quietly. A Chinampa system failing at scale means market stress, social strain, tribute pressure, and political consequences. The difference is not semantic, it is civilizational. The standard language also hides the technical intelligence of wetland agriculture. The Mexica were not compensating for poor geography. They were exploiting a rich ecological interface. The canal edges created microhabitats. Organic matter recycled nutrients. Water moderated the system. Canoe transport reduced friction. Intensification happened through proximity, labor, and ecological design rather than through animals and wheels. Several careful hypotheses follow. Perhaps Tenochtitlan's scale depended as much on Chinampa productivity as on conquest tribute. Perhaps European observers underestimated the system because it did not resemble familiar field agriculture. Perhaps colonial destruction was not simply the replacement of an indigenous city by a European city, but the replacement of one environmental operating system by another that was less suited to the basin, but more suited to imperial habits. That is the part history often sanitizes. Conquest does not only kill people and seize temples, it also murders infrastructure, then accuses the ruins of being inefficient. So the question stack sharpens. Was Tenochtitlan a city built in the wrong place, or a city built by people who understood that place better than their conquerors did? Were Chinampas primitive agriculture, or a form of urban ecological engineering that modern planners are still trying to remember politely? And when colonial systems dismissed wetland intelligence, were they correcting a flaw or destroying a solution because it spoke in the wrong architectural language? The takeaway is simple and not comforting. Civilizations do not always advance by replacing nature with infrastructure. Sometimes the most sophisticated systems are those that refuse to separate the two. Tenochtitlan farmed the lake because the lake was not the enemy. It was the machine. Dujiangyan guided a river without caging it. Tenochtitlan cultivated water without fleeing it. But in Southeast Asia, another empire faced a more violent rhythm. Months of monsoon excess, months of absence, and the royal expectation that rice, temples, and divine authority should all appear permanent at the same time. Chapter 6, Angkor, the Monsoon Empire with a water grid. The sixth fragment of our investigation sits under Cambodian heat, where you stand beside a Khmer royal engineer watching the sky turn black over Angkor. The rain does not arrive politely, it arrives like an army falling out of the clouds. Water strikes the earth, fills channels, swells basins, hammers embankments, and turns low ground into a moving problem. Then, months later, the same landscape dries under a sun that seems personally opposed to agriculture. The engineer has no concrete spillways, no electric pumps, no satellite forecasts, no climate model, no excavator, and no emergency committee producing a strategic resilience document after the disaster has already happened. He has labor, earth, laterite, stone, elevation, memory, royal command, and a kingdom that expects rice to grow as reliably as the gods expect praise. His king wants temples. The population wants food. The court wants legitimacy. The monsoon wants to be difficult. If this anomaly is taken seriously, Angkor stops being only a temple city lost in the jungle. It becomes one of the most ambitious water management experiments of the pre-modern world. A hydraulic civilization built to survive the violent rhythm of excess and absence. If the system worked, kings looked cosmic. If it failed, divinity developed drainage issues. The official case file is Greater Angkor's hydraulic landscape. UNESCO describes Angkor as extending across approximately 400 square kilometers, containing temples, hydraulic structures, basins, dikes, reservoirs, canals, and communication routes. The West Baray, identified in major research as the largest of Angkor's 4 Great Baray, measures about 8 by 2 kilometers. Broader mapping of Greater Angkor has covered nearly 3,000 square kilometers, revealing a vast urban and hydraulic landscape of reservoirs, canals, embankments, roads, rice field connections, and settlement zones. This was not a temple complex with some ponds nearby. It was a water grid on an imperial scale. Stone sanctuaries above, hydraulic metabolism below. Very spiritual. Also very muddy. The physical contradiction is scale under climatic violence. Angkor had to manage a landscape that swung between monsoon flooding and dry season scarcity. Too much water at the wrong time could damage fields, channels, roads, and settlements. Too little water at the wrong time could reduce rice production, weaken labor supply, and expose royal authority as something less than cosmic. The engineering was not merely irrigation. Irrigation is too small a word here. Angkor's system involved capturing, diverting, storing, slowing, distributing, and symbolizing water. Reservoirs could hold vast quantities. Canals linked zones across the landscape. Embankments shaped flow. Moats framed sacred architecture, while also participating in the hydraulic order. Roads and water channels interacted with settlement and agriculture. The entire system made the city possible by turning monsoon instability into managed productivity. Or more precisely, attempted to. Because Angkor's water system was not just a technical machine, it was also an ideological machine. Khmer kings did not build only for utility. They built to demonstrate order. Reservoirs and temples together created a political theology in earth and water. The ruler appeared as the axis between heaven, land, and fertility. Water control became cosmic proof. Rice fields became a kind of political argument. The harvest said the king was legitimate. That is a dangerous arrangement. Crops are not always respectful toward ideology. The systemic power layer is clear. A hydraulic grid concentrates labor. Someone must dig, clear, repair, monitor, and maintain. Someone must organize workers, allocate resources, resolve disputes, and decide where water goes when not everyone can have it. Large water systems create large obligations. They also create dependency. Once rice production, settlement, ritual authority, and royal identity become tied to a managed landscape, maintenance is no longer optional. It becomes the price of civilization. Who benefited from Angkor's water machine? Kings, temples, administrators, rice producers, craft specialists, and the enormous human network sustained by agricultural surplus. The system helped support monumental building, dense settlement, ritual life, and political centralization. It turned water into rice, rice into labor, labor into temples, and temples into claims about eternity. Human beings adore eternity. They are less consistent about cleaning canals. The problem with monumental systems is that they age. Sediment accumulates, channels clog, embankments weaken, maintenance burdens multiply. Political stress interrupts coordination. Local decisions create downstream consequences. Then climate variability adds its quiet brutality. When heavy monsoon events intensify, hydraulic works can be overwhelmed. When droughts stretch, storage and distribution become more fragile. A system designed to smooth seasonal extremes can become vulnerable when the extremes stop behaving within expected limits. The official historical simplification says Angkor was a temple city, famous for Angkor Wat and other monumental religious architecture, later weakened by environmental stress, political change, and regional shifts. This is broadly reasonable. It is also a masterclass in understatement. This textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical until one asks what the temples were standing on economically. Temples do not feed people. Bas-reliefs do not transplant rice. Towers do not clear sediment. Devotional architecture can express power, but it cannot produce calories unless somebody has already solved the less glamorous problem of wet feet, dry months, labor scheduling, and muddy hydraulic repair. Calling Angkor only a temple city is like calling an aircraft carrier a floating chapel with parking. The temples survive in stone because stone is shamelessly good at surviving. Water systems leave subtler evidence. Earthen embankments erode. Canals silt, reservoirs change. Tropical vegetation covers lines of infrastructure with the confidence of a sensor. Colonial observers and many later imaginations preferred the drama of temples swallowed by jungle. It made a better picture. It also made the city seem mystical, empty, isolated, and strangely detached from the rice fields that had made its builders possible. The erasure was not total disappearance. It was visual bias. Stone became the headline. Water became the footnote. The sacred skyline remained legible. The hydraulic operating system had to be reconstructed through archaeology, mapping, remote sensing, sediment studies, and the patient work of people willing to treat mud as evidence. The mud was evidence. It had simply not hired a publicist. Several cautious hypotheses follow. Perhaps Angkor's rise depended on the successful integration of water management, rice agriculture, labor mobilization, and royal ideology more deeply than older temple-centered narratives allowed. Perhaps its vulnerability came not from engineering failure alone, but from the burden of maintaining a system whose scale made flexibility harder over time. Perhaps climate stress did not simply destroy Angkor, but exposed the political and maintenance costs already embedded inside monumental hydraulic ambition. That is the courtroom turn. The question is not whether Angkor built impressive temples. It obviously did. The question is whether those temples distracted later observers from the deeper achievement beneath them. Was Angkor a sacred city supported by waterworks, or a hydraulic city that used sacred architecture to explain why the waterworks mattered? Did kings control water to prove divine power, or did the need to control water create the theater of divine power around them? And if the system weakened, what failed first? The canals, the climate assumptions, the political coordination, or the ideology that promised order in a landscape built on seasonal violence? The takeaway is not that Angkor was primitive, mystical, or doomed. It was sophisticated in a way that modern infrastructure planners should find uncomfortably familiar. It built a large system to manage environmental volatility. It tied food security to political legitimacy. It expanded maintenance obligations across generations. It trusted that the future would keep paying the repair bill. Egypt made flood rhythms administrative. Mesopotamia learned that canals can poison their own fields. Rome fed its capital through maritime dependence. Dujiangyan guided water by restraint. Tenochtitlan farmed a lake. Angkor built a monsoon grid and wrapped it in cosmic stone. But high in the Andes, another empire approached the ancient food problem from a different angle. Not by controlling one river, one sea, one lake, or one monsoon, but by storing risk itself across mountains, deserts, roads, and memory. Chapter 7. The Inca, the empire that stored tomorrow. Number 7. You stand beside an Inca storehouse keeper near a road station in the Andes, where the air is thin, the slopes are severe, and the empire has decided that geography is not an excuse. In front of him are maize, quinoa, dried meat, potatoes transformed into chuño, and other stored foods arranged with the calm seriousness of a state that has discovered tomorrow is easier to survive if it is inventoried today. A quipu record hangs nearby, its cords and knots carrying information in a form later Europeans would stare at, with the familiar confidence of people unable to read something and therefore tempted to downgrade it. There are no horses pulling grain wagons, no oxen dragging carts, no wheeled freight system, no coin economy moving market prices across provinces, no alphabetic writing in the European sense, no refrigerated warehouses, no lowland highway gently crossing the empire like a polite line on a map. There are mountains, there are deserts, there are valleys, there are roads, there are storehouses, there are labor obligations. There are administrators who understand that hunger is not defeated only by harvest. It is defeated by anticipation. If this anomaly is taken seriously, the final comfort of the old textbook narrative collapses. The Inca did not build a large state because they copied the obvious tools of the old world. They built a food system around risk, altitude, preservation, redistribution, and memory. They stored tomorrow before tomorrow arrived. The case file is the Inca imperial storage system. Recent syntheses of Inca economies emphasize surplus production, state-administered storage, staple finance, storehouses, and quipu accounting. Work on Inca state storehouses in the Xoxa region remains central to understanding regional storage capacity and contents. Archaeological reporting from Tambo Viejo has identified rare 500-year-old chuño, freeze-dried potatoes transported from the Andean highlands to the coast, showing long-distance movement of preserved food across ecological zones. The food list itself matters: maize, quinoa, dried meat, chuño, and other staples. And The missing technologies mattered just as much. No European-style alphabet, no horses, no wheeled freight, no coin economy, no refrigeration. A mountain empire looked at that inventory of absences and proceeded anyway. Terribly inconvenient for the theory that history only advances when Europe recognizes the tools. The contradiction is administrative. The Inca managed mobility without wheels and memory without alphabetic writing. That does not mean they lacked information systems. It means their information system did not flatter later historians by resembling paperwork. A quipu could encode quantities, categories, obligations, and accounts through chords, knots, colors, and positions. A storehouse could hold state power in material form. A road station could turn movement into logistics. A preserved potato could become a political technology. The engineering was not one grand device. It was a distributed survival architecture. The Andes do not reward simple agriculture. Altitude changes temperature, moisture, crop suitability, and risk across short distances. A valley may produce one thing, a highland zone another, a coastal region another. Frost, drought, slope, distance, and political instability all threaten food security. The Inca answer was not to force one crop everywhere like an empire with no imagination. It was to spread risk across ecological layers, then connect those layers through roads, labor, storage, and redistribution. This is the deeper genius of Chuño. Freeze-drying potatoes is not a quaint food tradition when seen inside an imperial system. It is shelf life. It is transportability. It is famine insurance. It is calories made durable by cold nights, sun, pressure, and knowledge. It turns a fragile harvest into stored time. The same logic applies to storehouses. A field feeds the present. A storehouse feeds the future. A state that can fill and manage storehouses can support armies, road crews, construction workers, ritual obligations, disaster relief, and imperial diplomacy. It can move food where harvests fail. It can make subjects dependent on redistribution. It can transform survival into loyalty, or at least into compliance, which states often accept as a reasonable substitute. Who benefited? The Inca state above all. Storage gave administrators leverage. It allowed rulers to demand labor while claiming reciprocal responsibility. It supported military movement and public works. It made the empire look protective, generous, and inevitable. The people could experience the state not only as extraction, but as emergency supply. That is powerful. A government that arrives with food after disaster does not need to explain ideology at length. The warehouse has already spoken. But the system also placed communities inside imperial obligation. Surplus did not simply appear in storehouses because everyone felt inspired by administrative beauty. Labor produced it. Fields produced it. Herds produced it. Local communities contributed it. The state collected, counted, preserved, and redistributed it. Reciprocity and coercion lived close together, as they often do when empires explain themselves politely. The erasure layer begins with conquest. Spanish invasion did not merely seize gold, topple rulers, and break political command. It damaged the network that made storage meaningful. A storehouse is not only a building. It is a node in a functioning system of roads, accounting, authority, labor, and trust. Break the state, and the warehouse becomes a ruin with leftovers. Then came the intellectual erasure. European chroniclers and later readers often treated Inca storage, quipu, and redistribution as exotic curiosities. Impressive, yes. Strange, certainly, but not always granted the same administrative dignity as alphabetic records, coinage, or written law. This is a familiar trick. First, define intelligence in your own format. Then declare everyone else partially illiterate for failing to submit documentation correctly. The orthodox explanation says the Inca built a vast empire through roads, military organization, terraces, labor taxation, and centralized redistribution, despite lacking writing and wheeled transport. Again, fair. The sentence is not false. It is just carrying an assumption under its coat. This textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical until the word despite is cross-examined. Despite no writing, despite no wheels, despite no coins, despite no horses. The phrase makes the Inca sound like a civilization constantly apologizing for missing equipment, but perhaps those absences are the wrong frame. The important question is not why they lacked old world tools. The question is how they built alternative systems powerful enough to make those tools less decisive in their own landscape. Alphabetic writing is useful. It is not the only way to administer. Wheels are useful. They are not equally useful on steep mountain trails built for human runners and llama caravans. Coins are useful. They are not the only way to mobilize labor and goods. A refrigerator is useful. Chunyo is also useful. And unlike a refrigerator, it does not become a decorative cabinet when the power fails. Several cautious hypotheses follow. Perhaps Inca power rested less on markets than on controlled flows of labor, food, and obligation. Perhaps Kipu accounting should be understood as part of a serious administrative technology rather than a symbolic supplement to real writing. Perhaps the empire's most important innovation was not stone masonry or roads alone, but the integration of preservation, storage, ecological zoning, and redistribution into a state metabolism. The final file forces the largest question. What is civilization measured by? The tools it has, or the problems it solves? Did the Inca lack writing, or did later historians lack the patience to understand non-alphabetic record-keeping? Did they overcome the absence of wheels, or did they design a logistical system for a world where wheels were not the obvious answer? And when an empire stores food across mountains before famine arrives, is that primitive redistribution, or one of the clearest forms of political intelligence humans ever invented? The answer is not romantic. Storage is never innocent. It can save lives, it can feed armies, it can stabilize communities, it can also bind people to power through dependency. The Inca stored tomorrow, but tomorrow belonged to the state. From Egypt's grain ledgers to Mesopotamia's salt-stained canals, from Rome's seaborne panic to Dujiangyan's river geometry, from Tenochtitlan's lake farms to Angkor's monsoon grid, the pattern has been consistent. Ancient empires were not fed by simple farming. They were fed by systems that turned landscape into authority. Food was never just food. It was the quiet architecture of power. Outro: the quiet architecture of power. If you made it this far, you were not watching for trivia. You were watching for the cracks. The official timeline prefers clean categories: farming, empire, irrigation, trade, collapse. Each word looks stable on a page. Then the evidence arrives and begins behaving badly. Egypt was not merely blessed by a river. Mesopotamia was not simply clever until the soil betrayed it. Rome was not fed by glory. Dujiangyan was not just a canal. Tenochtitlan was not a pretty lake city with floating vegetables. Angkor was not only a temple complex. The Inca were not limited because their records did not resemble European paperwork. The pattern is colder. Ancient empires survived when they converted landscape into administration. Floods became calendars, canals became tax systems, ports became political sedatives. Wetlands became farms, monsoons became royal theater. Storehouses became the future under lock and inventory. Food was never just food. It was salary, debt, tribute, ritual, labor control, disaster insurance, military fuel, urban peace, and proof that rulers had persuaded nature to cooperate, or at least persuaded people to believe they had. So the central question resolves as honestly as the evidence allows. Ancient agriculture was not simple. It only looked simple when the machinery was made of mud, memory, obligation, water, and human backs instead of steel, diesel, and software. The old systems were not primitive because they lacked modern machines. They were sophisticated because they solved modern problems without them. And they also revealed the oldest flaw in civilization. Every food system that feeds a population also creates power over that population. The granary saves lives. The granary also decides who waits. The canal brings water. The canal also creates obedience. The storehouse protects tomorrow. The storehouse also belongs to someone. This is where the romantic version of ancient history dies quietly, with excellent documentation. The lesson is not that ancient empires were wiser than us. They were human. Brilliant, coercive, adaptive, fragile, and deeply talented at turning survival into hierarchy. They built systems that could feed millions, then often let those same systems harden into dependency, exhaustion, and silence. So defend your theory in the comments. Which food machine was the most advanced? And which one was the most dangerous? Subscribe to Minimal Histories if you prefer history with the plumbing, accounting, and uncomfortable power relations left inside. Because monuments are easy to admire. The real empire was always underneath the bread.